At the beginning of the year, I started recording these podcasts, and not too long after I started doing podcasts on the books that I was reading. And there was a couple reasons that I decided to do that, but one of the main reasons I wanted to kind of do deep dives into the books that I was reading was that I was hoping that it would help me do a better job of remembering the stories and the lessons and the ideas from the book. Over the past decade, ever since I graduated from university, I've read a bunch of different books. And most of the books that I've read, I could not tell you much about the book. It's one of those, if I read it 7 years ago, Too Big to Fail is one of the books I read. I can't tell you anything about that book. So my hope was if I take the time not just to read the book, but write down the lessons learned and organize those ideas, and then take the time to put a podcast together where I talk through those lessons. I was hoping that that would help really cement those ideas into my brain, and it would allow me to recall some of those stories more often, and definitely years down the line. And so that was one of my hopes as I went through kind of this journey of recording these podcasts. And now that I've done 15 books so far this year, I can definitely say it has done a tremendous job helping me remember a lot of the stories. That said, there's still plenty of stories from these books that I don't recall off the top of my head, but I love going back and visiting them from time to time to remember those different lessons from all of these different people throughout history. So what I wanted to do today on podcast number 24 is to spend some time going through my favorite stories from the books, the stories that I find myself recalling most often, that I see that apply to my life in different ways. It's kind of interesting as I was going through this exercise of thinking about my favorite stories that I wanted to touch on for the year. Some of them will be the popular stories from the books, but there will also be some of the stories that I talk about will be stories that I had never heard before I read the book, and just aren't as common of stories that you would think would be the ones that have really stuck with me and resonated with me over the year. So that's what we're going to be doing today, is diving into some of my favorite stories from the different books that we've covered on this podcast. We're not going to be taking stories from each and every single book because that would take too long, and we're definitely not going to touch on every single story that I love, because that would take even longer. But with that, let's dive in. We're going to start with Sam Walton's book. I'm going to put Wisdom of the Bullfrog by Admiral McRaven and then Naval's book down, which feels crazy just skipping over these two books because there's so many great stories that I could tell from these two books, but didn't make the list for today. So let's dive in. This book, Sam Walton, Made in America, is an autobiography by Sam Walton, and it is hands down my favorite book that I've read so far this year. If there's one book I could recommend you, it would be this one. I even recommended it to my wife, and she picked it up and read it, and she absolutely loved it as well. And I will say the audiobook is fantastic. The guy who reads the audiobook did a great job with it. But that said, the story that really stuck out to me from this book is how Sam Walton approaches Saturday morning. So Saturday mornings are a big day for Sam Walton, and this starts early on in Walmart days, where he would get the managers together to go over what they learned. We'll touch on that in a second. And I'm going to start a little bit later in the book, where he talks about how early he would get his start on Saturday mornings. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, as I mentioned, I found out early that one of my talents is remembering numbers. I can't recall names and a lot of other things as well as I would like to, but numbers just stick with me and always have. That's why I come in every Saturday morning, usually around 2 or 3 a.m., and go through all the weekly numbers. I steal a march on everybody else for the Saturday morning meeting. I can go through those sheets and look at a store, and even though I haven't been there in a while, I can remind myself of something about it, the manager maybe, and then I can remember later that they are doing this much business this week and that their wage cost is such and such. I do this with each store every Saturday morning. It usually takes about 3 hours, but when I'm done, I have as good of a feel for what's going on in the company as anybody here, maybe better on some days. So I just love that. Even later on in his career on Saturday mornings, he's going in at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning and spending 3 hours going through all of the numbers in the business. That's one of the things that Sam Walton was really big on, is knowing your numbers and knowing what's going on in the business. He did a lot of work to build the information systems that allowed them to get as much real-time information as they could so that they could understand what that data was telling them and they could make adjustments quickly. And then going back earlier in the book, he kind of talks about how the Saturday morning meetings came to be early on. Diving back into the book, it says the only other reason this thing held together back then was that from the very start, we would get all our managers together once a week and critique ourselves. That was really our buying organization. A bunch of store managers getting together early Saturday morning, maybe in Bentonville or maybe in some motel room somewhere. We would review what we had bought and see how many dollars we had committed to it. We would plan promotions and plan the items we intended to buy. Really, we were planning our merchandising programs, and it worked so well that over the years, as we grew and built the company, it just became part of our culture. I guess that was the forerunner of our Saturday morning meetings. We wanted everybody to know what was going on and everybody to be aware of the mistakes we made. That's probably the part I love the most about this entire thing. He says we wanted everybody to know what was going on and everybody to be aware of the mistakes we made. When somebody made a bad mistake, whether it was myself or anybody else, we talked about it, admitted it, tried to figure out how to correct it, and then moved on to the next day's work. So I just love that. The entire idea of these Saturday mornings. He's waking up early at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. He's going through the books. He's making sure he understands what's going on in the business. And then he has a meeting with everybody or all of the managers in the company. And what do they talk about? They talk about, hey, these are the mistakes we made this week. These are the experiments we ran. This is what went wrong. This is what we need to make sure we don't do again, and making sure that they spread that information across all the different stores so that they're not making the same mistakes over and over again. And that kind of takes me to probably my favorite line or favorite quote that I've touched on in the podcast this entire year. I bring it up on most podcasts because I just love it so much. But it comes from a guy named David Glass, who was in the higher echelons at Walmart, and he worked closely with Sam from very early on. And this is what he says about Sam Walton. This is how he describes him. He says, two things about Sam Walton that distinguish him from almost everyone else I know. First, he gets up every day bound and determined to improve something. Second, he is less afraid of being wrong than anyone I've ever known. And once he sees he's wrong, he just shakes it off and heads in the other direction. So that's probably the most memorable thing from this book, Sam Walton, Made in America. Like I said, incredible book. Highly recommend you get it, either the hard copy or the audiobook. They're both just fantastic. All right, moving on to the next book. This is Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson, a fantastic book. The story that sticks out to me the most from this book, and I find myself recalling this story all the time, especially as I think about work. It's this story from the 2017 timeframe. And at this point, Tesla is trying to get to a point where they are making 5,000 cars per week. So essentially, Elon Musk has done the math and he says, hey, Tesla will survive if we get to a point where we can make 5,000 cars a week. But if we don't get to that point, we're not going to make it. And so at this time, they've got the gigafactory that they are building in Nevada. And that gigafactory is responsible for making the battery packs for the cars. And as he's going through the gigafactory, essentially what he's doing is he knows that the gigafactory has to get to 5,000 cars per week. I think at the time it's maxing out around like 17 or 1,800 battery packs a week. So they have to over 2x their production levels, right? They need to get from 1,700 or 1,800 all the way up to 5,000. And what Elon essentially starts doing is he goes to this factory. He ends up sleeping there at nights, and he's just going from station to station, trying to figure out where the bottlenecks are, right? So he'll fix one station. He'll get it to where that station is able to produce more. It's no longer the bottleneck. And then he'll just go from station to station to station, whichever station is the bottleneck, and figure out how do we improve this station so that it can get this entire assembly line to be creating 5,000 batteries and then 5,000 cars per week. And I just love this story because I think it's a great analogy for working at kind of any company, right? If you are in a company, there's the bottleneck of your company is going to move around, right? So maybe at one point it's sales, and your company needs to focus on sales and how you're doing sales and how you're thinking about sales. And maybe that's the bottleneck for the business. And so you need to put a lot of attention over there. And that's kind of like the station that you need to put attention to. But then maybe the next month it's something like customer support, and that has become a bottleneck for whatever reason, or maybe it's something on the product side that has become a bottleneck. So just that idea that the bottleneck of whatever organization you're in, or whatever it may be, that bottleneck moves around. And so as an employee in a company, or as a team member that's trying to help move the organization forward, you've got to realize that the bottleneck can move around. And I just think that's a great analogy. And it's also useful to kind of think of that through the lens of the people at the stations in the factory, right? Because their experience is, hey, my station right now may not be the bottleneck. I may not be getting a ton of attention because, hey, station 3 down the line is more of a bottleneck than mine. So I don't have a bunch of attention coming my way right now. But whenever station 3 gets cleared up, then maybe my station does become the bottleneck. And now I've got folks like Elon Musk coming to my station, asking me a ton of questions, trying to figure out what's going on and how we can improve things. And, maybe from that employee's perspective, it's like, hey, I didn't realize anything was wrong. The bottleneck has been somewhere else. And so, like, why is all of this focus on me now? And so that was just one of the things that, as I read the story and I pictured Elon going from station to station to station, trying to fix all of those bottlenecks, that is something that just I thought was a really good analogy for any organization or any team trying to solve a problem. Is just understand that bottlenecks in your organization will move around, and you want to make sure that you are looking for whatever the biggest bottleneck is and diving in and addressing those situations. So I'm not even going to read from the book any of the quotes there, but that's just really the general takeaway from that time in 2017, where Elon goes to the Gigafactory in Nevada where they're making the batteries, and then he goes to the Fremont factory in California and just ramps Tesla up to where they're making much more cars at a higher volume in a faster timeline. Just a great story, and like I said, great analogy for how the bottleneck moves around within an organization. Moving on to the next book. This book is Marine, The Life of Chesty Puller. And this book covers the just legendary life of Chesty. He is one of the most well-known military leaders in U.S. military history. And he fought in Haiti and Nicaragua prior to World War II. And then after World War II, he fought in Korea. And this book is just loaded with just absolutely legendary stories. And the first story I wanted to cover from the book is from the Korean War. This is from the Chosin Reservoir, where he has a group of Marines, and they are fully surrounded by Chinese communist troops. And this is a story about how he reacts when he finds out that he and his Marines have been surrounded. So here we go. Diving in on the book. It says, for 2 weeks, Puller had commanded the rear of the 1st Marine Division, cut off in the Chosin Reservoir region by hundreds of thousands of Chinese communist troops. The colonel was visiting a hospital tent where a priest administered last rites to Marine wounded when a messenger came. Sir, do you know they've cut us off? We're entirely surrounded. Those poor bastards, Puller said. They've got us right where we want them. We can shoot in every direction now. And so that's just one of those stories. As you read it, it's like, how epic would that be if you were a soldier and you found out that you were surrounded by the enemy, and you hear your commander respond with that line of, they've got us right where we want them. We can shoot in every direction now. Just a absolutely epic story. And this book is full of more stories like that. I could tell 10 more stories from this book that are very similar. The second story from the book I wanted to cover is this story that highlights the idea of profiting from your mistakes. And this actually ties into what we just talked about with Sam Walton, right? Sam Walton talks about how on Saturday mornings, one of the main things that they were doing is they would get the managers together to talk about the mistakes they made and share those mistakes so that they did not go about making those same mistakes over and over again. And Chesty Puller once he's back in the States after he spent some time on the battlefield. He's back and he's there to teach the other people in the military about his lessons learned. And there's just this really fascinating part. I'm going to dive in on the book. This is Chesty talking to folks in the American military. He says, "We just don't know all we ought to know about warfare, on land or sea. Just off Guadalcanal, not long ago, we lost 3 cruisers, blasted down by Jap guns as they sat there. Sitting ducks, that's all. I'll tell you exactly why we lost them. The admiral in charge got a plane report that the Jap force was approaching at 14 knots by daylight. So he figured that at this speed, the enemy couldn't arrive in his waters before the next dawn. After dark, of course, the Japs stepped up their speed to 28 knots and got to the scene at 3 a.m. when our men were not even at battle stations. It happened like that, I'm positive. And instead of keeping such things secret, we ought to have them emblazoned on the gate of every naval station. We must not be too proud or too stupid to profit by our mistakes, and God knows we make them." So that line just really stuck with me, especially we must not be too proud or too stupid to profit from our mistakes. This was something when I listened to the Jocko podcast that covered this book. He covered it pretty early on. It was years ago where I first heard that line when Jocko talked about it on his podcast. And it's one that's stuck with me ever since. And it's one that I still recall all the time. So awesome story there. And like I said, this was written all over the Sam Walton book, Profiting from the Mistakes That You Make. All right, moving on to the next book. This is the book Titan by Ron Chernow, which covers the life of John D. Rockefeller. As you can see, this is a very, very thick book. There's so many stories from the Rockefeller book that are worth telling. But the one or two that I'm going to pull out today are just ones that have stuck with me. The first one I covered on the podcast where we talked about this book specifically. It's about his job search. So when Rockefeller is in his late teens, it says he's 16 years old. He goes out and he's trying to find himself a job, and he knows the type of organization that he wants to work for, and he's going to go out and spend some time trying to land himself a job. So here we go. Diving in on the book, it says, despite incessant disappointment, he doggedly pursued a position. Each morning, he left the boarding house at 8 o'clock, clothed in a dark suit with a high collar and a black tie, to make his rounds of appointed firms. This grimly determined trek went on each day, 6 days a week for 6 consecutive weeks until late in the afternoons. I remember when I was in college, when I was doing a bunch of interviews for a job, I had 17 interviews before I landed my first internship. So those were spread across freshman year, sophomore year, and then after my junior year, I finally got an internship with a civil engineering company. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my goodness, like 17, it took me 17 interviews. I've gone through so much work in such a long process, and I thought I had done a ton of work. And then you read a story like this where Rockefeller was going around the town for 6 days a week for 6 consecutive weeks. So 36 straight days of all day walking around trying to find himself a job. It's just amazing how much time and effort he put into it. Skipping a little bit forward in the book, it says, for all the thriving waterfront commerce, the job prospects were momentarily bleak. No one wanted a boy, and very few showed an overwhelming anxiety to talk with me on the subject, said Rockefeller. When he exhausted his list, and so he had a list of all the companies that he thought he might want to work for. When he exhausted his list, he simply started over from the top and visited several firms 2 or 3 times. And then it talks about how he ends up landing a job on September 26th of 1855. And it says for the rest of his life, he would honor September 26th as job day and celebrate it with more genuine brio than his birthday. So I just love that story. Just a great story of perseverance and remembering that if you want something, you got to go out and get it, right? John D. Rockefeller, the guy who ended up becoming the richest man in America, and he's often cited as being the first billionaire. When he was 16 years old, it took him 6 weeks of 6 days per week of going out there and trying to find himself a job. The second story that I wanted to highlight from this book, it's actually a story that I heard first from David Sinra on his podcast, the Founders Podcast, which is an absolute incredible podcast. I highly recommend you check it out. But on his podcast, he talks about how Rockefeller had this ceaseless pursuit of even minor improvements. So here we go. We're going to dive in on the story about Rockefeller improving some of the processes within his company, Standard Oil. So here we go, diving on the book. It says, with a talent for seeing things anew, Rockefeller could study an operation, break it into component parts, and devise ways to improve it. Regarding each plant as infinitely perfectible, I love that line. Regarding each plant as infinitely perfectible. Like, imagine that if you just thought through every single process that you were doing or every single task that you're doing, like thinking of it as infinitely perfectible. I just love those two words. Going back to the book, regarding each plant as infinitely perfectible, he created an atmosphere of ceaseless improvement. Paradoxically, the mammoth scale of operations encouraged close attention to minute detail. For a penny saved in one place might be multiplied 1,000-fold throughout the empire. So essentially what that's saying is he has such a big empire that if you can figure out how to slightly improve this one process here, it's scaled up so large that that's going to result in saving a whole lot of money or a whole lot of time or creating a lot of efficiencies throughout the entire empire. Back to the book. It says in the early 1870s, Rockefeller inspected a Standard Oil plant in New York City that filled and sealed 5-gallon tin cans of kerosene for export. After watching a machine solder caps to the cans, he asked the resident expert, "How many drops of solder do you use on each can?" 40, the man replied. "Have you ever tried 38? Rockefeller asked. "No. Would you mind having some sealed with 38 and let me know?" When 38 drops were applied, a small percentage of cans leaked, but none at 39. Hence, 39 drops of solder became the new standard instituted at Standard Oil refineries. That one drop of solder, said Rockefeller, still smiling in retirement, saved $2,500 the first year. But the export business kept on increasing after that and doubled and quadrupled and became immensely greater than it was then. And the savings has gone steadily along, one drop on each can, and has amounted since to many hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's just an awesome story. I love that idea of regarding each plant as infinitely perfectible and creating an atmosphere of ceaseless improvement. And this idea that reducing the drops of solder needed to seal a can from 40 to 39 in the long term ended up saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. And actually, as I read this, one of the things I'm reminded of is this idea from Naval, and he talks about with founders. One of the things to look for is how much they care about the really small details, because when someone cares about the small details, that means that they're in it for the long term. It's because they see all of these small details as the foundation that they're going to build their company or their empire on top of. And so that kind of reminds me of this. This is a really small detail, but Rockefeller knows that his empire is going to grow, and he knows that each little improvement along the way is going to be multiplied tenfold because of the scale that his empire is going to eventually reach. So anyways, that's absolutely fascinating. Like I said, great book by Ron Chernow, Titan. Highly recommend checking that book out. All right, moving on to the next book. This is Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. This is one of the books that I had read in the past decade that I didn't really remember too many stories from before I revisited it for this podcast. So there's a couple stories in here that I wanted to touch on. The first one is this retreat that Steve Jobs does. It's called the Top 100 Retreat. I've mentioned it on a few of the podcasts before. Here, I'll just dive straight into the book. It says, once a year, Jobs took his most valuable employees on a retreat, which he called the Top 100. They were picked based on a simple guideline: the people you would bring if you could only take 100 people with you on a lifeboat to your next company. What an interesting thought experiment. If you had to think about, hey, who are the people that, if I had to only take this group of people to start my next company, what does that group of people look like? Super interesting question. Back to the book. At the end of each retreat, Jobs would stand in front of a whiteboard and ask, what are the 10 things we should be doing next? People would fight to get their suggestions on the list. Jobs would write them down and then cross off the ones he decreed done. After much jockeying, the group would come up with a list of 10. Then Jobs would slash the bottom 7 and announce, we can only do 3. And so this is something Jobs was just incredible at, is making sure that the company was prioritizing a small number of things. This is something that Jocko writes about in his book, Extreme Ownership, the law of combat to prioritize and execute. You can only be doing so many things as an organization. You have to prioritize. So here, the story where Steve Jobs, they've got this retreat. They make this long list of all the things they want to do. They narrow it down to 10. And then Steve Jobs takes the bottom 7 off and says, we can only do the top 3. I'm also reminded of one of the things that Steve Jobs talks about is how whenever they decided to build the iPhone, he had to take the idea for the iPad and just put that on a shelf for 2 or 3 years because he needed his entire organization focused on building the iPhone. So Steve Jobs was just really good at making sure the company was prioritizing those things that needed to get done. The second story that I wanted to highlight from the book is this fantastic story that I think hits on the idea of leading up the chain of command, or having people who are lower in the chain of command take the initiative and make things happen and look out for the best interests of the company. And so this story, it's about a guy named Bob Belleville. And what is going on at the time, this is from earlier on in the Apple days, and they're trying to get a disk drive for, I believe it's the Macintosh, what they're trying to get the disk drive to work for. And so Apple's internal team tried to build a disk drive and it was just going terribly. And so this guy, Bob Belleville, and Steve Jobs end up going to Japan to meet with different disk drive manufacturers to figure out which one they wanted to use for the Apple. And Bob wanted to use Sony. But Steve Jobs really didn't like Sony. He did not want to end up using Sony. So Steve Jobs decided that they wanted to go with a different supplier. And so Steve Jobs essentially signs on a contract with this other supplier, but Bob is very hesitant that this other supplier is not going to be able to come through and actually deliver on the disk drive. So Bob Belleville, behind Steve Jobs' back, is going to start working with Sony to make sure that in case that other supplier falls through, that they're going to have a backup plan. And so he ends up working with this engineer from Sony, and he even flies that engineer from Japan back to the United States. And that engineer is in the Apple building working with the Apple team, but they have to hide this guy from Steve Jobs because Steve Jobs doesn't know, and Steve Jobs doesn't like Sony. He doesn't want them working on the project. So here we go. Diving in on the book, this is when they're talking about the Apple engineers hiding this Sony engineer from Steve Jobs. It says, whenever Jobs would come in from his corporate office to visit the Mac team's engineers, which was almost every afternoon, they would hurriedly find somewhere for Komodo to hide. And Komodo is the engineer from Sony. At one point, Jobs ran into Komodo at a newsstand in Cupertino and recognized him from the meeting in Japan, but he didn't suspect anything. The closest call was when Jobs came bustling onto the Mac workspace unexpectedly one day while Komodo was sitting in one of the cubicles. A Mac engineer grabbed him and pointed him to a janitorial closet. Quick, hide in the closet, please, now. Komodo looked confused, but he jumped up and did as told. He had to stay in the closet for 5 minutes until Jobs left. The Mac engineers apologized. No problem, he replied, but American business practices, they're very, very strange. Bob Bellevue's prediction came true. In May of 1983, the folks at Alps, which is the other vendor, admitted it would take them at least 18 more months to get their clone of the Sony disk drive into production. At a retreat, Markkula, who's one of the leaders at Apple, grilled Jobs on what he was going to do. Finally, Belleville interrupted and said that he might have an alternative to the Alps drive ready soon. Jobs looked baffled for just a moment, and then it became clear to him why he'd glimpsed Sony's top disk engineer in Cupertino. You son of a bitch, Jobs said, but it was not in anger. There was a big grin on his face. As soon as he realized what Belleville and the other engineers had done behind his back, Steve swallowed his pride and thanked them for disobeying him and doing the right thing. It was, after all, what he would have done in their situation. So I just love that story of some engineers from the Mac team going behind Steve Jobs' back to make sure that the company made the right decisions in the long term. All right, moving on to the next book. This is The Everything Store. This is by Brad Stone, and it covers the story of Jeff Bezos and founding Amazon. 2 stories that I wanted to highlight here. And these are examples of stories that are just honestly a few paragraphs in the book. They're really small stories, but they really stuck with me. So the first one comes when Jeff Bezos is trying to raise some money from Amazon early on. And a guy named John Doerr, who's a successful investor, is going to go by and meet with Jeff Bezos to see if he wants to invest in Amazon. And this is John Doerr talking. He says, I walked into the door and this guy with a boisterous laugh who was just exuding energy comes bounding down the steps. In that moment, I wanted to be in business with Jeff. So I just love that line from the story. And I love it because it hits on the point of how important enthusiasm is and having energy for what you're doing. This guy, John Doerr, is talking about how he went to meet Jeff Bezos. And as he's meeting him, he just has a ton of energy and he's got this laugh and he's just somebody that you want to be around because he's very enthusiastic about the business. John Doerr says, I wanted to be in business with Jeff. And I just love that. And it actually reminded me, I'm looking right now, there's this quote from John D. Rockefeller and the letters that he writes to his son. And one of the things he says is the outcome of things is often proportional to our enthusiasm. Enthusiasm can make things 100 times or 1,000 times better. And many people do not know what enthusiasm is. And so just love that story because it highlights the enthusiasm that Jeff Bezos had very early on and how when this investor met him, he saw that enthusiasm and he was just automatically drawn to Jeff Bezos because of that. The second story I wanted to cover in the book is a story from later on in Jeff Bezos and the Amazon squad. They're a couple years into the business now. I think they're about 5 years into the business. And they end up bringing in a guy named Jim Collins who wrote a book called Good to Great. And they bring in Jim Collins to help them understand their business and think about the business and figure out how they can make Amazon a bigger and better company. And they have this retreat where they're talking with Jim Collins and they go over the book and the lessons from it. And one of the things that Jim Collins talks about is this idea of a flywheel kind of process within your company where it's like, what's a flywheel that you can get going that just builds your company? And it's like a self-fulfilling loop that keeps building and building and building and building. So anyways, with that, I'm going to dive in on the book. It says, drawing on Collins' concept of a flywheel or self-reinforcing loop, Bezos and his lieutenants sketched their own virtuous cycle, which they believed powered their business. It went something like this. Lower prices led to more customer visits. More customers increased the volume of sales and attracted more commission-paying third-party sellers to the site. That allowed Amazon to get more out of the fixed costs like fulfillment centers and the servers needed to run the website. This greater efficiency then enabled it to lower prices further. Feed any part of this flywheel, they reason, and it should accelerate the loop. And this is the part I love right here. Amazon executives were elated, according to several members of the team at the time. They felt that after 5 years, they finally understood their own business. So that's the part that I loved hearing right there. He's talking about how this idea of this flywheel and this idea of lower prices bringing more customers in, more customers bringing more vendors in, and more sales, allowing them to build things at scale at lower cost. And this idea of this flywheel, once they all drew that out on the board and once they were all able to visualize that, they felt like they finally understood their own business. And that story reminds me of a story from the book Extreme Ownership. And it's from the chapter leading down the chain of command. And in this story, there's a very similar situation where this one visual or this one concept gave everyone on the team a perspective about what they were doing that they hadn't seen before. And so this story is going to happen after Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, the authors of this book. They went to fight in Ramadi in 2006. Ramadi is a city in Iraq. They were leading the Task Unit Bruiser, which was one of the most highly decorated SEAL units from the war in Iraq. And after they get back, Jocko is tasked with passing on some of the lessons that they learned. And so one of the things Jocko is going to do is he's going to put together a slideshow for a presentation to show some of the people higher up in the chain of command what exactly they did in Ramadi and what the mission was that they accomplished. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, shortly after Task Unit Bruiser returned to the United States in late October of 2006, Jocko was asked to build a presentation for the Chief of Naval Operations, the most senior admiral in the Navy. Jocko took a map of Ramadi and built an overlay that depicted the geographic areas that had been completely under enemy control when we first arrived. From this map of Ramadi, Jocko built a PowerPoint slide that depicted how the Ready First Combat teams seize, clear, hold, build strategy systematically through months of effort, established a permanent presence in the enemy-held neighborhoods, and pushed out the enemy fighters. And I actually got to see this map and this overlay when I went to Echelon's Front's muster event. And so you can kind of picture a map, and it shows how at first the American areas, they only had a few areas, and there's a lot of the map was controlled by the enemy. And you can kind of see over time which points the American forces started taking, and they would just expand outward and outward until the entire map was controlled by the American forces. So here we go, back to the book. It says, the slide depicted how Task Unit Bruiser SEALs had been the lead element for virtually every major operation to build a combat outpost in enemy territory and take those neighborhoods back. So the combat outpost would be kind of the new dot in the middle of enemy territory, and then they would expand out from there. When Jocko showed me the slide he had built, it all came together for me for the first time. Though I had been directly involved in the planning of almost all of these missions, had been on the ground leading the team of operators, coordinated with the other elements on the battlefield, and had written detailed reports of what happened after each mission, I still had not linked them all together, nor considered the strategic impact they had had. But now Jocko's brief captured in simple terms all that had been accomplished in the Battle of Ramadi. So I just love that story. It's very similar to the one that we just covered from the book, The Everything Story with Jeff Bezos, right? They talk about the flywheel, and it talks about how after 5 years of working at Amazon, once they drew out that flywheel, they finally felt like they understood what the business was doing. And same thing in this story from Extreme Ownership, Leif is talking about how he spent 6 months in Ramadi. He was there next to Jocko. He was leading the troops. He was writing the detailed reports. But it wasn't until months after they get back from Ramadi and he's briefing the leadership up the chain of command, and he sees this PowerPoint that Jocko makes that visually depicts the strategy that they had and what they were doing. That's when it clicked for Leif. And then he goes on to talk about how important it is to make sure that you are simplifying the mission down to the people below you in the chain of command. That's why it's in the chapter leading down the chain of command, because how can you articulate what you're doing and making sure everyone is thinking about it in the same way? So I love it. It's a flywheel from Jeff Bezos' book, The Everything Store, and the map from the Battle of Ramadi from Jocko and Leif. All right, last story I wanted to touch on. This is from the book, The Nvidia Way. This is about Jensen Huang and the founding and building of Nvidia. It's an absolutely fantastic book. I found out earlier today from one of my buddies that Nvidia is now valued at over $5 trillion. It's the most valuable company in the world. So very interesting book, just tons and tons of great stories here. But the story that I wanted to touch on is a story from the NV30. So the NV30 was one of their products that they were making a few years into the company being around. So they built their first two products, the NV1 and the NV2. Both of them had their issues, but they ended up having a successful product after that. And then later on, they've got this product that they're working on called the NV30. And the NV30 is being made for Microsoft, but there's a little bit of confusion because Microsoft hasn't released all the specifications that it needs. So they're trying to match this product to this Microsoft system that they're not exactly sure how it's going to work. And then another thing on top of that is, at this point, Nvidia had just hired 100 engineers from a competitor company that had just gone under. So they've got 100 engineers from a new company that they're trying to integrate into their teams. And they also are trying to build a product for Microsoft where they don't quite have all the requirements they need to from Microsoft. So here we go. Diving in on the book. It says confusion reigned both from the lack of clear guidelines from Microsoft and from a lack of coordination between Nvidia's own teams. A former employee remembers an incident when a group of hardware and software engineers were standing in a cubicle and looking at the lackluster performance data from the NV30 during its development phase. So you've got two teams. You've got the software team and the hardware team, and they're trying to figure out why the NV30 has lackluster performance data. One perplexed software engineer said that it was almost as if the hardware fog shader feature had been removed. The hardware architect replied, "Oh yeah, we took that out. Nobody used that." The software team was stunned. Fog shaders were still widely used in most games. Nvidia's hardware team did not consult anyone before they removed it, nor did they seem to understand how important it was. All of a sudden, it was as though Nvidia's various teams were siloed, the very kind of organizational structure the company had rejected from the start. And the book goes on to talk about multiple instances of a similar thing happening, where there's two teams that are both working inside Nvidia that aren't talking to each other, and those miscommunications are causing mistakes to be made on the product. So there's multiple other stories like that. There's some from Elon Musk's book where it talks about different teams that are building the Tesla car, and he would go to this one team and say, "Hey, why is this component there?" And they would say, "Hey, that team told me that we needed it." Like the engineer told me we needed it. So he would go to the engineering team and say, "Hey, why is that part there?" And they would be like, "That team said that we needed it." And he would essentially find out that no one exactly knew why these parts were needed, and they would end up testing to see if the parts were actually needed. And he found out that you could just remove it. So there's just multiple instances of different stories from these books where it talks about how two teams within the same organization aren't communicating, and that leads to problems down the road. And it's just really good reminder for me how important it is to communicate within an organization and make sure that other people know what you're working on, and you know what other people are working on, and you know how you can support those other people, and they know how they can support you, so you don't have instances like this happen where you've got the hardware team and the software team that are both working on the same product, and they're not communicating, and you make simple, silly mistakes because of a lack of communication. So with that, those are the stories that have really stuck out to me the most from the first 15 books that we've covered on this podcast. Like I said at the beginning, there's so many more great stories. I'm sure I'll make another podcast at some point that dives into different stories from these books, because they're also fascinating. If you want to check them out, I mean, go listen to the podcast. I covered most of the stories I covered today on the previous podcast, and in those podcasts I do deep dives into the Nvidia way, Steve Jobs' book, Sam Walton's book, Rockefeller, all of them. So anyways, with that, appreciate you taking the time to listen, and let me know if you enjoyed any of these stories, or if you have any other favorite stories from these books if you've happened to read them. I'll catch you next time.